It was a remote stretch of prairie, quiet, windswept, and seemingly safe. But beneath that quiet lay a profound isolation, where the nearest neighbor could be a mile or more away, and during the brutal winter, some were completely cut off for days, or even weeks. In this vastness, when terror struck, you were utterly and terrifyingly alone. In this corner of the Midwest, families worked the land with calloused hands and deep faith, enduring back-breaking labor in hopes of a better future. Life was simple, but it was never easy. And in the spring of 1920, that hard-earned peace shattered. On a single tragic day, nearly an entire family was wiped out, gunned down at their own home. Children, parents, no warning, and no mercy. It was one of the most shocking crimes in North Dakota's history, and over a century later, the echoes of that day still linger across the plains. So what happened in that farmhouse near Turtle Lake, and what could possibly drive someone to kill, not just once, but 8 times? This is the story of the Wolf family murders. Hello friends, my name is Marcia, and this is Midwest Murders. Turtle Lake is located in McLean County in central North Dakota, about 60 miles north of Bismarck, the state capital. In 1920, it was a small but growing farming community, founded just a few years earlier in 1905 during a wave of railroad expansion and settlement across the Great Plains. The area was primarily populated by German-Russian immigrants who were drawn to North Dakota by the promise of fertile farmland and religious freedom. The town itself sat along the Sioux Line Railroad, which helped transport grain and goods, but the surrounding countryside was rural, remote, and harsh, especially during the winter months. Most families lived several miles outside of town on isolated farms with few close neighbors. In towns like Turtle Lake, law enforcement was sparse. A single town sheriff might serve an entire area. When violence erupted, justice often moved slowly, if it came at all. Jacob Wolf, age 41, was a prosperous farmer, well-liked by his neighbors and generally considered well-to-do. He lived on a secluded farm about 2.5 miles north of Turtle Lake with his Russian-born wife, Beata, age 35, whose quiet strength was the backbone of their home. They had 6 children. Bertha, age 13, who was already a big help with the family chores. Maria, age 10, who had a budding curiosity about the world. Edna, 8, Lydia, 5, Martha, 4, and the newest addition to the family, baby Emma, 8 months old. Also with them on that fateful day was 13-year-old Jake Hoffer, an orphan boy who did chores around the farm, finding a place and a purpose within the Wolf household. On Saturday, April 20th, 1920, at about 1 p.m., farmer John Kraft and his wife drove to the Wolf family farm after seeing harnessed workhorses wandering the field. He had seen another harnessed workhorse wandering on Friday and knew something was wrong. Pulling up in front of the 2-story frame farmhouse, he got out and knocked on the door. Not getting an answer, but clearly hearing baby Emma crying, he tried the door. It opened. Seeing the blood-soaked kitchen floor, a chill colder than the prairie wind came over him. He picked up the telephone to call authorities. The line was dead, severing the only fragile link to the outside world. He grabbed up baby Emma and took the infant to his wife, who was still sitting in the car. The baby's cries, once a sound of life, now echoed with a chilling loneliness. Hearing the unnatural grunting of pigs in the barn, he headed toward the cowshed to investigate. He was met with a horrifying sight. There, in the corner, in a pile of hay, was the body of Jacob and 2 of his daughters. The pigs, unfed for 2 days, were chewing on Jacob's face and arm. Authorities arrived to find Maria and Edna in the barn covered with hay and Jacob thrown on top of them. Traces of blood in the barnyard led authorities to believe Jacob had been running to the house when he was shot and then dragged into the barn. Beata, Lydia, Martha, Bertha, and their hired hand Jake, all dead, were found in a heap on the cellar floor. A pair of blood-soaked overalls was thrown beside them. A bloody hatchet was also found, but it's unclear from reports whether it too was found in the cellar or in the firebox in the kitchen. Numerous shotgun shells were scattered about, and there was no sign of a struggle. The telephone lines had been cut. Dishes from their last meal were still on the table. It was believed the killings took place just after the noon meal on Thursday, April 18th. John Kraft reported that baby Emma had been scantily dressed in her crib in the bedroom. There was no heat and a window had been opened even though the weather had been very cold that week. A defenseless infant in a freezing room. A window left open. As a parent myself, it's a detail that screams something was terribly wrong. In 1920, law enforcement in North Dakota, particularly in small towns like Turtle Lake, was minimal and decentralized. Complicating matters further, North Dakota had very few state-level investigative resources in 1920. There was no statewide police force, no formal crime lab. Rural lawmen lacked the training or tools needed for complex investigations, especially those involving multiple victims or forensic evidence. The magnitude of the crime, the cold-blooded killing of 8 people including children, was unprecedented in North Dakota at the time. A wave of shock and terror ripped through the scattered community. Reports indicate confusion at the crime scene, with neighbors entering the house and contaminating evidence before officials arrived. Local law enforcement quickly realized they were ill-equipped to handle such a large and gruesome case. The public demanded answers and quick justice. Recognizing the scale and the potential for public outrage, Governor Lynn Frazier took the rare step of dispatching his Attorney General, William Linger, to take over the investigation personally. Linger, a rising political figure, understood that the reputation of the state and his own career depended on solving this horrific case quickly and decisively. Understanding the limitations of local authorities, 2 private detectives from Minneapolis, reportedly experienced investigators from national detective agencies, were hired by Langer to assist with evidence collection, witness interviews, and suspect tracking. This move drew attention both for its urgency and for signaling how seriously the state was taking the case. Detectives found that Jacob had intended to purchase 80 acres of land with cash, and since he did not have any money in the bank, it was speculated that he had the money in his home safe, possibly as much as $3,000. The safe was locked, and when opened, $100 in cash and several $100s in certificates of deposit, not kept in the cash drawer, were found. However, the cash drawer itself was empty. While this led detectives to believe that robbery was not the motive, Beata's family was adamant that someone had forced her to open the safe, took the cash that was in the cash drawer, and locked the safe back. They also believed it was someone in the community who knew the personal affairs of the family. This early contradiction hints at a deeper mystery, a motive perhaps misunderstood or deliberately concealed. Bloodhounds were brought in from the state penitentiary, and the detectives interrogated everyone within a 25-mile radius of the farm. A neighboring farmer, John Brecken, reported that he had seen 2 suspicious men walking rapidly away from the Wolf farm toward Turtle Lake shortly after noon on Thursday. They were subsequently identified and questioned. Nothing tied them to the murders, and they were dismissed as suspects. Detectives also found a neighbor girl who said she heard shots at 10 a.m. Thursday morning and more around noon, coming from the direction of the Wolf farm. Another neighbor, Mrs. Christian Haas, said she was talking to Beata on the telephone Thursday morning about 10 a.m. when the line suddenly went dead. On Sunday, the day after the murders, at about noon, a 2-barreled 12-gauge shotgun was spotted by a neighboring farmer in a pond about 1 mile from the Wolf farm. The stock had been detached and was floating in the water. Police believed it belonged to Jacob and was the murder weapon. However, family and friends disputed that it belonged to him. A critical piece of evidence, yet its ownership and its connection to the crime remained stubbornly vague. There are many theories about what happened on the Wolf farm that day, but based on the evidence and reports, this is what I believe may have occurred. The assailant was likely already on the property by 10 a.m. This is supported by 2 things. The telephone wires had been cut, and Mrs. Haas reported that her call with Beata was abruptly disconnected about that time. It's a small detail, but an important one. Around the same time, a neighbor girl reported hearing gunshots. I believe those were unrelated to the murder, likely coming from Jacob himself as part of his routine farm work. On any given day, a farmer might fire a weapon to scare off predators or for other practical reasons. Those shots may have alerted the intruder that Jacob was armed, causing him to hide until just the right moment. We know from the testimony of a neighboring farmer that Bertha and Jake were seen plowing a field around 11:30 a.m., which places them, and I assume the rest of the family, alive at that time. As noon approached, the family likely returned to the house for their midday meal. After lunch, Jacob headed to the barn, while Bertha and Jake returned to the field. These would be the family members most likely to put up a fight. That's when I believe the killer made his move. He entered the house and likely forced Beata to open the safe, taking the cash from the cash drawer. Afterward, he locked the safe again, a detail that suggests theft was the motive. He then forced Beata, Lydia, and little Martha toward the cellar. Beata and Lydia were both shot in the back of the head at close range. Some reports suggest that they were found behind the cellar ladder, indicating they were shot in the basement. But that seems unlikely to me. To shoot them from behind in the cellar, the assailant would have had to turn his back on them in order to climb down the ladder. That kind of vulnerability doesn't fit with the controlled way this crime appears to have been carried out. Let's pause here, because the next part is where everything falls apart, both in the crime itself and in the justice that followed. I believe they were shot as they began descending the ladder. The use of a double-barreled shotgun, which holds only 2 shells before requiring a reload, may explain why Martha was killed with a blow to the face with an axe. I believe the killer used a pair of overalls to clean up the blood on the kitchen floor, then tossed them into the cellar with the bodies. Meanwhile, Maria and Edna, who may have been in the bedroom and unnoticed when the intruder entered, escaped through a window. This might explain why the window was found open on a freezing day with an infant in the room. No parent would have left a child exposed like that under normal conditions. Clothing in the bedroom suggested that someone had been folding laundry that morning. Footprints in the grass outside the window support this theory. The girls ran to find their father. I believe Jacob told them to hide while he headed for the house. As he approached, the assailant likely exited through the kitchen door. Jacob, seeing the man armed, turned to flee. He was shot in the back from a distance in the barnyard, and then again at closer range. His body was dragged into the cowshed. There, the killer discovered Maria and Edna hiding, and shot them both in the back of the head. Back in the field, Bertha and Jake became aware something was wrong and rushed toward the house. They were still wearing their work gloves, and their plow horses were later found abandoned, still harnessed, wandering the farm, suggesting they had left them in a hurry. They entered the kitchen. It's possible Bertha noticed blood near the trap door and opened the door to the cellar. She turned around when she heard the intruder and was shot in the face, the only victim to suffer gunshots to the face. Jake was shot in the back of the neck when he turned to flee. Both bodies were then thrown into the cellar with the others. While only speculation, this theory aligns closely with the known evidence and offers a possible explanation for how the tragedy unfolded on the farm that day. What is the most chilling part of all of this is that the killer would have had to reload the shotgun 3 times. But even with a crime this horrifying and a grieving town demanding justice, what followed next raised just as many questions as the murders themselves. The only suspect in this case was 35-year-old Heinrich C. Henry Layer. He was from a small Russian settlement in what is now Ukraine. A neighbor of the Wolfs, he was a small man, known more for his quiet, mild manner and gentle disposition than any hint of violence. He made a fair living on his farm. He was married with 6 children ranging in age from 9 years to 11 months. He was arrested on Tuesday, May 11, 1920 at his home, 4 miles from Turtle Lake, taken to the nearby town of Washburn, 20 miles away, and placed in the McLean County Jail, instead of being taken to the Turtle Lake Jail. He confessed at 12:30 a.m. Thursday morning. He had his preliminary hearing later on Thursday, where he pleaded guilty to murder in the first degree, was immediately sentenced to life in prison, and taken to the state penitentiary almost exactly 48 hours after he was first arrested. The judge was W.L. Nussel, who gave Henry every opportunity to change his plea, request an attorney, or request a postponement. 10 minutes after pronouncement of sentence, Henry was in McLean County Sheriff Stefferod's car with Turtle Lake Chief of Police Chris Martinson as a passenger. This is believed to be the fastest administration of justice on record in the state. Almost immediately, Henry recanted and said that he was forced to confess by the use of the third degree and threats of mob violence. Could this gentle farmer, who barely spoke English, truly have orchestrated such a brutal massacre? A signature obtained after 36 hours of interrogation where he maintained his innocence until the last 30 minutes alone with investigators. Chief Martinson disputed this, saying that Henry was only questioned for 4 hours and was never mistreated. Family members, believing he had been railroaded, circulated a petition requesting a pardon from the governor. Several prison officials testified on his behalf, saying that he had been beaten before he arrived at the penitentiary. His appeal for a new trial was denied in October 1921. An estimated 3,000 to 5,000 members of the community attended the family funeral, which was conducted in German on the family farm. The 6-mile-long procession followed the caskets to the Turtle Lake Cemetery, where the family and Jake Hoffer were laid to rest. Baby Emma inherited a well-equipped farm, free from debt, valued at $30,000, about $483,000 in today's money, and would be raised by her maternal aunt and uncle, Christina and Emmanuel Hoffer. She would later graduate from college, marry, and raise 3 children. She died in October 2003 at the age of 84 and is also buried in the Turtle Lake Cemetery. The governor originally held up payment of the $1,000 reward, but it, together with the $10,000 reward offered by the community, was eventually paid to Turtle Creek Police Chief Chris Martinson. Henry's wife Lydia filed for and was granted a mother's pension. She divorced Henry in December 1921 and left the state. At 3:10 a.m. on March 21, 1925, Henry died in the state penitentiary from a blood clot following an operation for appendicitis. He was laid to rest in the Potter's Field in the Fairview Cemetery in Bismarck with no marker. Author Vernon Keel has written a historical fiction about the murders called The Murdered Family. I have linked it in the description below if you're interested. Henry Layer's confession raises serious doubts. It was the cornerstone of the prosecution, yet the cracks in its foundation were apparent from the start. He claimed to have shot the entire Wolf family, yet never once mentioned using a hatchet, despite the fact that little Martha was clearly struck in the face with one. He said he picked up the spent shotgun shells from the kitchen, but in the cowshed he allegedly threw the shells into the hayloft. That doesn't make sense. Even more baffling, he said he cut the telephone wires after the murders. But why would he do that once everyone was already dead? It simply doesn't make any sense. Despite these inconsistencies, newspapers praised the investigation as one of the finest examples of police work in the state. In reality, the sheriff admitted early on that they had no clues. Their approach was to look for a motive, and then find someone it could be pinned on. When asked in court what the motive was, Henry told the judge that Jacob had once asked him, 6 months earlier, to keep his cattle out of Jacob's hayfield. He said there was no animosity between them and that he didn't feel threatened. But in his confession, the story was different. He claimed he went to confront Jacob about a cow of his that had been injured by the Wolf family dog. 2 different stories, and no clear motive. Henry's arrest also raises red flags. Sheriff Welch of Burleigh County stated that Chief Martinson was the first to spot Henry as a suspect on the day of the murders, and that from that moment on, authorities focused solely on gathering evidence to support his guilt. Henry was interrogated through the night on Tuesday, all day Wednesday, and into the early hours of Thursday morning, all while maintaining his innocence. Then, just 30 minutes after being left alone with Martinson and another investigator, he confessed. Martinson later admitted that he and George McDowell, a special agent with the Northern Pacific Railroad working under Attorney General William Linger, had forced the confession bit by bit. Adding to the concern, no one, not Henry's wife nor his neighbors, knew where he was being held after his arrest. Authorities kept his detention secret. His preliminary hearing was held quietly and quickly during the noon lunch hour, while the courthouse was nearly empty. Henry didn't read or write English very well. Court records show that the state's attorney wrote and then read the confession to him, and he signed it. In the 1920s, false confessions were likely frequent, but underreported and misunderstood. The lack of safeguards and the use of brutal interrogation techniques created conditions where many people confessed to crimes they didn't commit. Today, historical criminologists and legal scholars consider that era to have been especially prone to injustice through coerced confessions. Appeals weren't automatic. A person convicted of a crime had no guaranteed right to appeal unless specific legal grounds were present, such as a procedural error or denial of rights. Many defendants didn't have legal representation after their trial ended. If they were poor, and most were, they often lacked resources to pursue appeals. The public defender system as we know it today didn't exist in most states. 8 lives lost, all gunned down on a lonely country farm. It remains one of the most horrifying crimes in North Dakota history. But justice, if you can call it that, came swiftly, too swiftly. Henry Layer, a neighbor and fellow immigrant, was arrested within days. Under pressure, he confessed, but inconsistencies in his statement, a lack of physical evidence, and a questionable interrogation left more questions than answers. There was no clear motive, no eyewitnesses, and the shotgun, supposedly used to kill the family, was never recovered. Some said Henry was nervous, perhaps even guilty. Others believed he was poor, uneducated, and terrified, a man pushed to confess to something he didn't do. What we know for certain is this: the Wolf family was brutally and senselessly murdered, and the truth behind what happened on that farm may never be fully known. Was Henry Layer a cold-blooded killer, or a convenient scapegoat in a time and place where justice was hurried and resources were scarce? If you have any thoughts or theories about this case, please leave them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and may the truth reveal itself in the shadows.